Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Lynne Hardy, who is the line editor for Rivers of London and an associate editor for Call of Cthulhu. And we talked about the magic system in Rivers of London. In Rivers of London, you're going to be doing cool wizard stuff. So it's very important to have a robust and interesting magic system underpinning the game itself. Lynne talks about how the system works, what cool stuff it includes, and gives some advice on how to best utilize it. I'll jump across to the interview with her in a moment, but first, please subscribe to our channel, and thanks for watching.
So, from a narrative perspective, you kind of have magics almost in two camps. You have the stuff that the demimonde, what we would call maybe the fairies, the rivers, the genii locorum. There's kind of the stuff that they can do, which sometimes is minor, sometimes is pretty epic. And then there's the stuff that the magicians do, the wizards. So that certainly there's multiple different systems, so all different cultures have their own way of doing things. The one that's been fleshed out in the books is what's known as the Newtonian magic system. And that is the system of magic that was devised by Sir Isaac Newton. So it's very rigid, very formulated, and it relies on the wizard basically forming images in their mind that will trigger the spell and linking it to sort of like an activation phrase. So what's known as a former. So you start off basically learning a single former. Originally, they were linked to kind of like the Empedoclean version of the elements, so earth, water, fire, that kind of thing, light. Um, and then as you progress and you get control over your single former, you learn another one, and then you start stringing them together. And the more you string together, the more flashy the effects, or the bigger or more powerful the effects are, or the more subtle they become. And there's other little twizzles and bells and whistles that you can put on that just tweak things ever so slightly. So it's very, very formulated. Lots of Latin.
So when somebody is jumping into a Call of Cthulhu game and they start to look into spells, almost immediately they're going to find their character totally insane, struggling to string together the magic points to be able to blast something without draining their life force. What's the difference between magic in Call of Cthulhu and magic in Rivers of London, still from a narrative perspective?
Well, from a narrative perspective, magic in Call of Cthulhu is always bad news, even if you don't think it is. It's the start of the slippery slope. Because by learning spells, you are opening yourself up to the mythos, learning more about the mythos, and that's never a good thing. They tend to be harder to find. They tend to be quite hard to learn. There are serious implications, as you say, in terms of magic points, hit points, but also sanity. And yeah, it's generally not a good idea. You might have to, but it's never going to end well. There's always going to be something that comes to get you. But Hounds of Tindalos for a start, they love you casting spells. So yeah, it's just generally bad all round. Whereas in Rivers of London, narratively, it's very handy storytelling device because it allows you to do certain fun things and exercise your brain cells in terms of figuring out how to use some of these slightly esoteric spells to create fun story elements. I mean, there are issues, there are potential dangers. If you do too much magic too badly, are you not trained really how to do it? You can fry your brain cells.
So let's talk about the mechanics for a little bit. When I've seen magic done in tabletop role-playing games, it tends to be either very formulaic, where you have lists of spells that you can cast and nothing else, or very freeform, where it's much more about intention. You can kind of draw from all kinds of powers. How does Rivers of London work?
Well, if you read the novels, the magic system is very freeform. It's you have a word that is associated with an effect, and then you plug those together. So it's very like Ars Magica. You're assembling words to create what you want. And Ben's a gamer, and that was at the back of his mind when he was designing the Newtonian magic system. Now that was something that Paul and I considered, but we wanted the game to be for we wanted it to be accessible to people who hadn't necessarily gamed before. Now, a system like that is fantastic because it gives you huge amounts of freedom and variation. But my goodness, that is intimidating if you've not run something like that before and you've not played something like that before. It's kind of information overload, choice paralysis, because it's like, oh my, what is going to happen if a player puts these two things together? How do I, as a GM, riff on that and make something work? So we basically decided to go with the other direction, which thankfully the magic system also works for, which is spell levels, because that's built in. Because you have a different number of formi per spell as they become more complicated, that effectively works out as a spell level. So if you have to string 2 formi together to make a spell, that's a second order spell. If you string 3 together, that's a third order spell. And thankfully that technology is in the books as well. So, we had the option to go either way. We decided to go with the spell list because we thought that would be more straightforward and more accessible for people who weren't as confident or were new to gaming to actually get their heads around and make use of.
We've talked a little bit about the power level that is present in Rivers of London before. When your characters start to be picking up spells, would it be correct to understand that they will be rarely, unless you're playing a longer term campaign, straying beyond first order spells?
No, we tried to build that in so that people weren't hideously underpowered at the start of the game. I mean, to be fair, Peter Grant, the main character, pretty much knows Lux for the first novel and a half, if I remember correctly. And it's not, then he starts to learn more formi and how to string them together. Now, the way the books are written, because it's more sort of like the free form, I can tweak this and it can do cool things. He's got quite a bit of freedom with what he can do with that single former, and we wanted to try and give that to the players, even though we were using a spell list order level kind of format. So you actually start the game with 3 spells rather than 1, 2 first order spells and 1 second order spell. Depending on which route you're learning magic, because not everybody in London is a Newtonian magician. Some of them are what we call hedge wizards, and that's more kind of like you've learnt it from your aunt, you've learnt it from your friends, you've kind of accidentally picked it up somehow, or you've read it in a book and you've had a go. So it's kind of like the more folky, much less structured version of it. So they get to choose their 3 spells exactly what they get, whereas there's a little bit more blinkered. You have been formally trained, therefore the first one you learn is Wearlight, because that's the first spell any Newtonian magician learns, kind of thing. So again, we're trying to reflect the books in that. But like I said, we were very aware that we didn't want players just to start the game with a single spell and be limited to that. So there is a relatively quick progression in terms of you picking up spells. There are limits on what you can do. So we've kind of built it like a pyramid, apart from some of the non-player characters from the books, because obviously it's not been entirely detailed what some of them have. So we've taken a few liberties. So Peter might have, slightly more spells of a higher level than a lower level, mostly just because that's the way they've been written. But they're NPCs. They can kind of do their own thing.
One of the most exciting things that I find about picking up a new system with a bunch of spells in it is to immediately flick to the back of the book, find the highest and coolest spells. We don't want to get them all, obviously, because it would spoil too much. But can you give us one really cool high-level spell?
Well, there's Wallbanger, which isn't the highest level spell in the book, but that's the one for people who know the novels. That's the one that allows you to unzip buildings.
That is incredible. I've read a fair few of the books, and I do not believe I know that one. I've got something to look forward to, I think.
In I told you my memory was fried at the moment.
That's all right.
It's the one where oh no, I can't even say that because that's a spoiler for the end.
Well, we'll jump into a last question then. We've talked a little bit about the basic bones of the magic system, some of the cool stuff, what people can expect when they jump in. Why is the Rivers of London magic system going to be particularly exciting? If you're thinking of jumping into the game and the way that the magic is played is going to be a big part of why you jump into it, what do you have to say to GMs who are going to be putting together their first campaign or tossing up whether they want to dive into Rivers of London?
So the whole idea is that, this is magic police solving weird crimes. So you need to make sure that your players have those opportunities to actually use their spells creatively or even in a very basic way. I mean, let's face it, a lot of the time in the novels, Peter uses a waylight just because he hasn't got a torch. So don't worry about how they can use those spells, just give them the opportunities. Obviously, if you've got characters that don't have spells, make sure they've got things to do too, because they're still a valued member of the team. You've got people like Zach Palmer. I mean, okay, he's Fae, so he can do slightly strange things, but that's hopefully how we designed it. Well, everyone has a talent that they can bring to the table in terms of characters. Just make sure people can cast spells. We did build in that even if a character starts without magic, they can learn it. Because the whole idea is that magic isn't something that only chosen ones can have in this world. Everyone can do it. It's just usually safer if you learn how to do it formally, so you don't fry your brain by doing it wrongly. And there are several examples in the novels where people do way too much too quickly and end up seriously hurting themselves.